Hello everyone, today we're going to make a pillowcase. It takes a little bit of time because there are a lot of seams, but it's not that hard. And I'm going to show you how to cut the fabric and then I'll walk you through how to sew everything together. So this is just a completed one. Materials that you'll need is a big cutting mat, or you can do it on a smaller one. You just have to shift your fabric around as you're cutting it. But I like to use my big cutting mat. It's 24 by 36, and then I have a fairly large ruler. It is 6.5 by 24, and then my rotary cutter. If you don't have a rotary cutter, then I would suggest you have a pencil for marking your cut line, and then a pair of sharp scissors. So to make 2 pillows, well, let's talk about the size that you need first. So there's the main fabric of the pillowcase. That's this part here, and you need 27 inches of that fabric. This is what we call the cuff. That's the top part, and you need 9 inches for that. And then this accent fabric, or the flange, you need about 2 inches. If you want it a little bit smaller, just cut it at, say, 1.5. If you want it larger, which I wouldn't go, it's your preference, but I like the 2-inch size. And then you lose about 1/2 inch for the seam allowance, and it's folded in half, so you end up with about 3/4 showing, 3/4 of an inch. So since the body of the fabric is 27 inches, if you want to make 2 pillows, you can purchase 1.5 yards of the main fabric, and then you need 1/2 yard of the accent fabric. 9 inches plus 9 inches is 18, which is 1/2 yard. And then you just need some smaller strips. I already have my strips cut. I just happen to have some extra fabric left over that I picked out for my accent. So just maybe 1/8 of a yard is probably the minimum that you can purchase. But you want to have a piece of fabric that goes all the way across the fabric from selvage to selvage. So this part right here is called the selvage. And it usually has some colors on it. It has the colors that are used in the print. And then it also has the name of the fabric line, the designer, and the fabric manufacturer. So this one is Wild and Free by Abby Hall for Moda. So Moda Fabrics is the manufacturer. And I have enough here for 2 pillowcases. I'll just be making one today. But you want it to be the width of the fabric, which when it's folded, it's about 22 inches. Because we're going to cut the selvage off, we won't be using the selvage. So you want to have that width of fabric. That's going to be the width of your pillowcase. So this will be the bottom. This is directional fabric, so I will have to pay attention to how I place the fabric when I sew it, so that I get my cuff on the top. Generally, that's how I would view a pillowcase. You'd have a top with the cuff would be at the top. So we want width of fabric on all our pieces. And to start off with, we're going to cut the main fabric to 27 inches. And I normally cut this on a bigger table, so I'm a little cramped here today. So what I'm doing is just lining it all up straight, square on my mat. And I'm going to stand up so I can cut better. So I'm going to line the folded edge up along one of the lines here so I know that I'm cutting perpendicular on all my cuts. And then I'm going to, I have my inches come across here, so I'm going to come to the 27. And if you don't have a big ruler like this or a mat cutter, just find, measure it this way with a measuring tape maybe, or a yardstick. You could measure 27, just mark it with a pencil in a few spots, and then take your scissors and cut along the dotted line. Okay, and then I'm just going to cut at the 27. I usually cut left-handed, so I'm not pushing all the way through. Okay, so that's the main piece of fabric. So we're going to set that aside for a second. And I'm done with this, so I'll put that on my shelf. Okay, for the accent fabric, we need 9 inches. So again, I'm going to come to where it says 0, line it up straight, smooth it out nice and flat. Now my cut is not straight, so I'm going to trim that up a little bit. I'm going to trim up the beginning edge just a little bit, so I have the exact size on both ends. Okay, and then I'm going to come to the 9-inch mark. Okay, so for this pillowcase, that's all we need is that one section. So now we're going to even up all our pieces and trim off our selvage. So I'm going to start with the biggest piece. The main body. And just to make it easier to cut, I'm going to fold this in half. So I'm going to line up my folds lines. I'm going to get it nice and square. So what I'm going to be doing is trimming off this selvage, because we don't want, it's a tighter weave, it's a different color, so we don't want that in our pillowcase. Same thing on this fabric. You have the selvage, so I'm just going to line this up on top. Let me press this out a little bit. It's got a little wrinkle on it, which it may mess up my measurement, so I'm going to iron that out, iron that flat. And this is just a little wool pressing mat, because I'm working on my sewing table instead of my cutting table. Usually I iron at the ironing board. Okay, so I'm going to line up my folded edge, and then we're going to trim everything at once so they're all the same. And let's see, this was just an extra scrap, so it's super long. So I've got plenty of this. Here, let me just line that up at the top there, kind of make sure I've got it straight. Okay. Then I'm just going to take my ruler and I'm just going to come in enough to cut off that selvage. But this selvage comes out to here. This selvage comes out to here. So this cuff fabric is just a little bit smaller. Different fabrics are different sizes. So you just want to find the edge of the selvage. And sometimes the selvages are even different widths. You might have a really wide selvage, you might have a skinny selvage. So I'm just going to cut a little bit away from the selvage. And I also want to line up my ruler here so that I'm cutting straight across, perpendicular to the lines of the fabric. So there, I'm lined up straight this way. I'm cutting off enough of the selvage, and let's see, that's going to give me 23, 22, yeah, so that's going to give me just a little over 22 inches wide, which is 44, which is plenty for our pillowcase. So I'm going through a lot of layers here. Make sure everything cuts, close your blade, and then we don't need these scraps. All right, so that's how we cut all our pieces. Now comes the fun part. We're going to pin these together so that we can go and start sewing. Let me move my ruler out of the way. All right, so we are going to start with the cuff, and you're going to open it up so it goes all the way across, flat, one layer, not folded. And then we're going to take, now this is where I have to think, make sure I get it facing the right way. Put this one up. And I want it going, if it's directional, you want the top against the top of this fabric. I'm pretty sure that's going to work. So what I'm doing, I'm just laying it down here to line it up. It's better to have lots of space to spread this out, but we'll make it work here. Then you're going, oh, I forgot a step. Before we lay this one down, we want to press it in half to make it into a flange. So we're going to press it in half all the way down the length. And then the cut edges, or the raw, what we call the raw edge, not the folded edge, the cut part here, that edge goes along the top of our pieces. Okay, so taking the cut edge and we're going to place it right there. Now I'm going to put a few, well, I'm going to use some clips, I think. That'll be quicker. You can pin it. I have these little wonder clips, so those are a little bit faster. I'm just going to put a couple in here just temporarily because we have one more step to do before we start sewing. So just making sure that everything's lined up at the top. Smooth that down. Line this one up. Line up your flange. And don't worry if you're off just a little bit on the edges there, because we're going to be trimming that up at the end also. Okay, so here's the next step. We kind of want to spread this all out, so hopefully you'll have a little more space to work than I do. You want to take your main fabric now and you want to roll it up. You can fold it in half, or fold it up a little bit and then roll it. That's a little bit quicker. But I'm just going to roll this up so I can see this fabric underneath. And then this fabric, the edge of this one comes up and meets the edge of these fabrics. And so focus on the edge here, make sure you got everything square. And then you can use the clips, you can use pins. But my blue piece is going to want to shift, so I want to put a lot of pins in there so nothing moves while I'm sewing it. And another option, if you want, you could do a little basting stitch on each one of these if you're having trouble pinning those. You could match them up and sew a little seam just to kind of get it anchored down instead of trying to go through all the layers at one time. But that means you have to sew over it several times. So we just want to be careful not to stretch out this fabric. We don't want to stretch and pull on it. We just want it to lay nice and flat. And I don't know what's in this pin cushion, but it makes my pins sticky. So let me grab another pin cushion. I like using these long pins with the flat heads on it. So just double checking my fabrics, lining everything up. There, much better. They're not sticking. So you want a few more pins than what I had with the clips, because I'm using a striped fabric. Normally I wouldn't have to worry about this, but I'm kind of I think I'm stretching my fabric too much. So I'm going to kind of double check my alignment here. So see, you can see it, I've got orange stripe here, orange stripe here. So I'm going to put those together. But typically, you don't have stripes on your fabric, so you don't have to worry about lining it up that way. I think it got distorted a little bit because of all the bulk that's inside. So you just want to just be careful, lay it down carefully. Match up all your edges. And just take your time pinning. I know a lot of people don't like to pin, but I find that everything comes out cleaner, neater, more accurate when I take the time to pin. Now my stripes are matching up great. Those are all lined up. Let's check this one. That one's lined up. Very good. Okay, that's better. So the clips are nice, but they will get yanked off and pulled off. So when I'm doing a lot of layers like this, I do like to use the pins. Clips are good for temporary holding. Okay. So the next step is to sew down this edge all the way down, catching all the layers in our seam. We just want to make sure we catch everything in there. So, you know, if you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, another thing you can do is draw a sew line on your project with a pencil. I would use a pencil. Don't use a pen or a marker, might bleed through. But what you want to do is take your ruler, and there's a 1/4 inch marking there. Just lay that on the edge, very edge of your fabric, and then draw your sew line. Just draw a line all the way down here. And that'll be your guide on where to sew. Now I've been sewing a lot of quilts, and we do 1/4 inch seams on quilts, and I have a 1/4 inch foot on my machine. Okay, we're just going to go sew all the way down. Be careful of those pins, they're still pokey. Alright, I'm just going to match up the very end here. Goes underneath my presser foot, so I don't put a pin in there. Line it all up, slide it under the presser foot. I like to do needle down, and then you can also do a couple back stitches here. That'll just help when we turn it right side out. It won't pull apart the stitches. So I do like to back stitch on this part. All right, I'm just going to plug along, and I'm just going to peek in there into my, we call this a burrito style pillowcase. So I'm going to look into my burrito, make sure all my layers are lined up. Checking my layers. My blue accent piece wants to shift, so that's the piece you need to keep your eye on. Make sure it doesn't slip too far away. Otherwise, it won't be caught in your seam, and it'll unravel when you turn it right side out. So also, when you're going through so many layers, your top fabric has a tendency to want to shift this way from the presser foot. So I'm just adjusting, making sure that everything's laying flat. If it moves a little bit, that's fine. It's not going to hurt anything. The main thing on this step is just to make sure you're catching all the fabrics in your seam. Take your time, make sure you're checking all your layers. And even though I pinned mine are still shifting, so I'm just making sure that they're all laying flat. It'll be fine. This top layer is shifting quite a bit, so I'm not happy with that. Almost to the end now. Because of all this bulk here, it's wanting to pull out from underneath my presser foot, so just go slow, make sure you're guiding it straight in. Then as you come to the end, just go nice and slow. And then do a back stitch at the end of your seam. All right. So now the next step is to reach in here, and we are going to turn this right side out. So just gently pull the fabric away from the edge, pull the center out, just keep pulling. Takes a little bit of time, but it's coming. See if I'm stuck here or something. Here we go. That little edge got stuck there. All right, here we go. So just pull your burrito inside out, or actually right side out. There we go. And what we end up with is all your seams on the inside. So there's no raw seams showing on our pillowcase. The next thing I like to do is to press this all forward, and then you could do a top stitch along the cuff here right above the accent if you want. That just kind of holds everything together. I'm going to iron from the other side first. So we just want to make sure that that seam is opened up all the way. You don't want any creases. So I'm just going to do right on the seam because I don't want to mess up the front by pressing too far in. So it's nice and flat. Press that seam open. You can kind of feel if you're pulling all the fabric out of your way or not. Press this open. Something was bunched up there. Got a little wrinkled when I turned it right side out. Okay, now I'm going to press on the other side, right above. So you want the flange to come down, you want the seam allowance to go upward towards the top. And this one opened up pretty good when I was pressing the back, so just going to make sure it's all the way open. Give it a good press. Pressing down. Like I mentioned, here, oops, got a little string. Like I mentioned, you could top stitch along this seam allowance. That'll just help hold everything together after you wash it. Sometimes this flange wants to flip up the other way, but if you do a top stitch, that kind of holds it from flipping up. So I'm going to get my seams opened real nice and flat. Okay, and then what I want to do is press my cuff here. And if you had a bigger ironing surface, you could probably do it at the same time, but because I'm working on a small mat, I wanted to do them separately. So all I'm doing is pressing the folds up at the top. That's going to be the top part of your pillowcase. So see how I've got a couple little wrinkles because the fabric shifted over a little bit. So I'm just going to press it flat, and pressing it will just get rid of those wrinkles. It'll kind of smush it down and it will be fine. So you can see I've got a little extra on this end That's kind of how much that fabric stretched, because I was stitching such a long seam, and the presser foot on the top kind of puts pressure on that fabric and pushes it down. So that's how much it shifted just from the presser foot. Okay, now the next step is to do the seams, and we are going to do a French seam. It sounds hard, but it's just extra sewing. It's easy. But the first thing I want to do is line up my sides, make sure I've got everything exactly the same. So I'm going to line up my blue accent, line up my top, and everything else should line up just fine. It's up here at the top where I want to make sure that I've got a straight, nice even edge to sew against. So I'm just gonna, hopefully you can see that. Let me slide down a little bit. So I just folded my fabric in half, lined up the top and the blue and the two edges here. So I'm going to just line everything up so I've got a nice straight edge to sew along. There we go. Okay, so for the first step, we're going to put right sides out or wrong sides in. So usually when we sew a seam, we do it the opposite way. We put right sides on the inside. But the way we do a French seam is we sew on the right side, then we turn it wrong side out, and we do another stitch that catches this seam allowance inside the seam. So you would have no raw edges then on the inside of your pillowcase. So I don't need to pin this because it's pretty straightforward, straight seam. I do want to make sure that I line up my accent fabrics. Be nice if those came together at the same spot. So I'll just put a couple pins right there just so it doesn't shift while I'm sewing. And then my top should match. If it's off a little bit, don't worry about it. Mine's off just a tiny bit. So I'm just gonna kind of match them up, and then hopefully, and when I sew, the feed dogs will actually gather up that extra material into the seam. Poking myself. So that's really the only spot that I pin. If you want to put a couple more pins in here, you can. That'll just help you kind of as a place marker know that your fabric isn't shifting. A couple of these small ones. So that's just, you know, an area to aim for. Those are my anchor points. So I sew from here to the next one. So we're going to go down the side, and then we're going to go across the bottom. All right, and again, so my seam is off a little bit, so I could take my ruler and I could just sew it, because we're going to trim these up anyway. We're going to trim off the extra seam allowance. But if you want your edges even, just put the ruler on top of the shorter one. There, I just trimmed off that extra. Now I have a nice straight, even line to follow on the sewing machine. Now some people will think, oh, let's start here where the fold is, but then when you get over here to the top, you could be off. So I always like to start up at the cuff, and that way I know I have the cuff exactly in the, I have all those, the accent piece lined up exactly. Again, you could take your ruler let me grab a smaller one. And the ruler has a 1/4 inch mark on there, so I could just line up the edge of the fabric against the 1/4 inch and then take my pencil, there it is, take my pencil, and now this is going to be my sew line. So if you're not familiar with sewing a 1/4 inch seam, or you don't have a 1/4 inch foot on your machine, that can be very helpful. Gives you a guideline to sew by, instead of trying to align this up with a tiny marker on your machine. You could draw the sew line and then just follow the needle down that sew line. Okay, slide over a little bit. And we are going to do a back stitch on the beginning and the end, because we are, it's not going to go into another seam. So anytime you're sewing an an exposed seam, you want to do a back stitch. So again, we're going to do a 1/4 inch here. We will be trimming this, so don't stress if you don't get it exactly a 1/4 inch. But just get it as close as you want, as close as you can. The critical thing, or the important thing, I guess you could say, is that your seam is straight, your sew line is straight, and it's consistent, but mostly straight. You just want a nice straight seam. So I'm just going to go all the way down, making sure that my edges are even. That's why it does help to pin, because once you get it up on the machine and it starts flopping around, it tends to move. So, but it's real easy to just stop and line it up. Line it up about 6 or 8 inches from the needle, and then hold it with your right hand so it doesn't move. Just guide it towards your needle. Take your pins out. That's all lined up. I'm going to guide it towards the needle. So I usually just come down to like the edge of my sewing bed and hold that and just guide it up. If your fabric is straight out from the needle, it should just guide straight in. If you have it off to the side, you're not going to have a straight line. If you have it off to the right, it's not going to be a straight line. So if you line it up straight from your needle, it should go into the needle straight. So because I was only going through 2 layers, my layers didn't shift this time. All right, so now I'm going to stop about a 1/4 inch from the bottom edge. So just go nice and slow. and then stop with your needle down. That should be close enough. Needle down, then you can pivot and the fabric doesn't move. You don't lose your stitch line. And then we're going to go across to the folds. Okay, checking my edges, make sure that they're nice and straight. Okay, slow down at the ends and then do a few back stitches. I'm going to trim my threads up here at the top. Now, in order to catch this seam allowance in this next seam, we want to trim this edge down to about 1/4 of an inch. I'm sorry, 1/8 of an inch. So, but the reason I sew 1/4 inch is because it goes through the machine a lot better if you have at least 1/4 inch seam. When you sew just 1/8 an inch on your machine, the feed dogs are only pulling the fabric on one side of the feed dogs. There's 2 sets of feed dogs, on the right, on the left. And if your seam allowance is real skinny, just the feed dogs on this side, the fabric's only feeding on one side. So it doesn't go through as even. So I like to do 1/4 inch because we have plenty of fabric here. It's nice and wide. Your pillow will fit. We're just going to cut off 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to find the 1/8 marker on my ruler, line that up on my seam, and then trim. My thread's so light I can't see it. There we go. So I'm going to come down to the edge here, and I'm just going to trim 1/8 off, and that will leave 1/8 of an inch. Now, if you don't have a rotary cutter or a big long ruler, you can do it with a smaller ruler. You'll just have to, move the ruler along. Or you can also do it with a yardstick or a 12-inch ruler. You could draw the line and then cut it with your scissors. So you don't have to have a cutting mat, a ruler, a rotary cutter. You can do it with just a regular ruler, a pencil, and scissors. So I'm just going to trim this. I'm just going to go nice and slow, making sure I get everything. Checking that the ruler hasn't moved. You don't want the ruler to slip, because if you cut into your sew line, then you'll have to sew a new line that is in further. But it's not the end of the world. You just have to sew a new line. Do a new stitch line. Okay, so my ruler didn't go all the way to the bottom. So I'm shifting everything down here so you can see and I can reach. There we go. Okay, then I'm going to turn it this way and trim the bottom edge off. Same thing, just 1/8 of an inch. So I line up the seam under my ruler on the 1/8 marker, 1/8 inch marker. Can't quite see where the thread is. And so your seam, your seam doesn't go straight, then just keep shifting your ruler so that you're getting enough trimmed off, but not too much trimmed off. Okay. The other section, other little spot I like to trim is just in the very corner, just a little bit off there, but don't cross over your stitch line. So just very small pieces I trimmed off. That just gets rid of some of the bulk in the corner. Okay, now we're ready to turn this inside out, and I like to reach in, push my corners in, and pull the corner out. So we want to push these corners all the way out so that we get a nice flat seam here. That's good. I have this little tool that I like to use. Don't, you know, a pen will work. Just be careful it's not too pointy, because it will poke, you know, you can poke through your fabric if you're not careful. Okay, so the next step I like to do, just to help get a nice flat seam, is to press my seam open here on the inside. Sorry about that, my iron turned off. Okay, so I'm just going to press the seam to one side just so it's open. You don't want creases there. Yes, and some people aren't really, they don't like to iron, but I find it really makes a difference in my projects to press things open, press things flat. Now I might not be able to get in here to get this open, and the seam's going the wrong way on me. So the goal is to be able to press it this way. So we want the edge of that seam to be right there on the fold. So by pressing this seam nice and flat, I have a better chance of catching the first seam in my seam allowance on this side. So we're going to do another, we're going to sew all the way around again to make our French seam. So you just want to make sure that your fabric's open all the way and it's right on the fold. The seam is right on the fold. And just taking this extra step to press and fold it accurately, it will really help at the end when you turn your pillowcase right side out. You won't have any raw edges showing. So again here, so maybe just I can't get the iron here, so I think I'm just going to finger press this open. Just kind of scraping at it with my fingernail. That helps. Just making sure that that seam is open all the way and it's right on the fold. So if I had my ironing board, I would just continue, keep going. Almost done. There we go. So we're just going to sew this seam. And again, if you don't have a 1/4 inch, here, I'm gonna go this way. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot for your sewing machine, or a good marker on your sewing machine, you can draw the 1/4 inch line. Let me use the other edge. So there's a 1/4 inch marker here that's a dotted line, a real good marker. And see how straight my seam is? It doesn't wobble all over. And then all you have to do is draw your pencil line along the ruler, and now that'll be your stitching line. And you'll be able to feel inside here the seam allowance, that first seam allowance goes to right about here. It goes right about here, and we're going to sew inside, closer towards the middle, so that whole seam allowance is caught into this seam. Now, because it's already stitched down, there's nothing to pin. You just want to make sure this is nice and flat. You want to be careful when you sew over top of these stitches here, because you're going through a lot of layers. Just go very slow with your machine, and it should go over it just fine. And again, because this is a exposed seam, we want to do a back stitch first. So this is where it's important, that 1/4 inch seam is important, so you're catching the edge of that. You're encasing, you're going to cover up the seam from the first go around. Alright, so I'm coming up on all that bulk, so I'm just going to take it nice and slow. Our machines don't like to go through that much material. Might have to give it a little tug on the outside, just to help it go through. Not much, just a little bit, just to get over that. It's a big hump. You've got a lot of layers there with all the seam allowances and 3 different fabrics. Okay, and as you come up on the bottom, you're going to stop about a 1/4 inch from the bottom. Now my foot has a 1/4 inch marker on it, so that helps me know where to stop. And I stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot, and turn it. And now, because the needle is down, it holds my fabric in place. And then I can put the presser foot down and finish sewing. Slow down as you come to the edge, and when you get to the edge, do a few back stitches. That's an exposed seam, so we want to lock that thread in there so it doesn't come out. And I like to go backwards and then come forward again on that last little bit, just to give it an extra knot in it. And that is it. That's all the sewing. So let's turn this thing right side out. So get your finger in that corner, pull it out, push your corners out, and you might have a little bit of bulk in the corners, but just push them out as best you can. You don't want to trim off any of the seams on the inside because they're all sealed. And then we can also press this seam open flat, press it flat and press it open. So first I'm just going to press it open. Wants to be difficult. There we go. And I probably can't get into that corner, so I'm just going to finger press it. Same thing for the bottom, just pressing that seam open. I could run the tip of the iron across there, but you don't want to push down because then you'll get a crease in there. But I find that my finger does a better job. I can get in there and make sure that I'm actually opening the seam. And then this is where you just want to fold the fabric, making sure that the seam is right there on the edge of the fold, and then you can press this down too. And you can see here on my seam, there's no raw edges. There's no raw edges poking through from that other seam. The other seam is inside the seam allowance. So that's called a French seam. Okay, then I'm just going to press it. It'll just lie flatter. Might have some stray thread, but you can just pull those out. And if you did have a little piece of the seam allowance that is kind of peeking through, just take your scissors and just very gently trim it away as close to the seam as you can. I think the first time I made one of these, I didn't have it perfect, so like here's a thread. I'm trying to pull it off, but it won't come, so I'm just going to clip it really close with the scissors. But you should end up with a pillowcase with no seams showing. So there's no seams where we sewed the accent fabric and the cuff on, and there's no raw seams on the inside because we did the French seam. So that is it. I think my grandson is going to love these teepees. That is so pretty. And I have enough fabric to make a second one. And that's how I like to fold my pillowcases. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video on how to make a pillowcase burrito style. Thank you.